Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Wilma Harris. I am co-chair of the local organizing committee for the conference, and I'm delighted to see all of you here this morning. And I'm particularly delighted that the weather's cooperated for me. Not good? Okay. Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay. It's been very well supported by Community Heritage Ontario to work together to get this done. And we're particularly proud of the fact that our committee to organize the conference includes representatives from our two communities, the Municipality of Bluewater and the Municipality of Goderich. Yeah, one cheering over there. Yay. So we have a busy morning ahead of us. And before we begin, I'd first of all like to thank the sponsors of the conference. We have received generous support from a number of organizations and individuals who recognize the value of heritage in our communities, and we're very grateful for their support. Their names are listed on the back of your conference programs if you'd like to thank them personally. In the meantime, I'd like first off to introduce our Mayor of Goderich, John Grace. Who has a few words of welcome.
Thank you very much. A little sleepy this morning, I think. There was did only one person put their hand up there a little while ago? Anyway, good morning and welcome to Goderich. But I'd like to know who in this crowd stayed up like I did till midnight last night watching the Raptors. Yeah. Amazing. What's that? Absolutely they won. Absolutely. They're a little more lively now. It's great to see so many people out at this conference and here in Goderich today. They're still strolling in. I see Vicky is coming in right now. But it's all about Heritage Days, and I'm glad you're here. It's great to see everyone. Welcome to Goderich, the Port of Goderich, and the County of Huron. Heritage can be seen from one end of this community to the other and across Huron County. This book that you put out, Ontario Heritage Conference, I look at it as not only a conference, but a real recognition and celebration of our heritage, your heritage. It's not only heritage, but it's tourism and it's the economy. It drives a strong economy. The two communities together to host, and I think that is something new. It's new to a lot of conferences when you have two communities coming together to host an event. Last night, you heard the harps, I'm told, in Hensel. But I must thank the committees that put this on today and all the volunteers that it requires to put on an event like this. Remember, Goderich is almost 200 years old, and within a few years, probably 8 or 9 years, I think it's 8, we'll be celebrating that 200th birthday here in Goderich, and come on back and help us celebrate. Return to Goderich. You won't be able to see it all today or tomorrow. There's lots to see. Thank you for coming to Huron County, and enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Whoops. Am I on here? You got me? Okay. Thanks so much, John. It was great. I'd now like to introduce Wayne Morgan, who's the president of Community Heritage Ontario, who is here to welcome you now.
Thank you. I'm going to stand down here so I can see the slides. Do you have the clicker?
Oh, we never did.
So welcome. Community Heritage Ontario is the Association of Municipal Heritage Committees. And welcome to Goderich Bluewater. It's the world's biggest salt mine, started in 1866. It's got a fantastic jail. Hope you don't have to go there, but notice the shape of the jail. They like octagons and pentagons in Goderich on the left, and also in Bluewater. There you have Bayfield, same sort of plan. Whoops, let's go the right direction. But one thing I think you should take away from this conference, and I think that is important, is disaster. This is a town that has recovered from disaster. It was struck by a tornado in 2011, and there you can see some of the damage. Buildings were blown away. So go back to your municipality and look at your disaster plan. Do you take care of heritage buildings during a disaster? And it's not just the tornado that comes through, but it's the rain that comes after when the roofs have all been removed. So at this conference, you will learn from others. You're from across Ontario, so find out about their experience. You'll be inspired by what you see in Bluewater, Goderich, and you'll see what's happening in southwestern Ontario. You'll also get a chance to network, again, people from across Ontario, and also think about what we have achieved as a heritage community. At last year's conference, I mentioned that at the Pink Palace, there was a new set of rulers there, and we should watch what's going on. Well, something has gone on, and on May the 2nd, so not very long ago, they introduced Bill 108. I hope you're all familiar with that, and in particular Section 11, which deals with amendments to the Ontario Heritage Act. You have until Sunday to comment on this. Our challenge is to respond positively to the changes and deal with the outcomes. There are going to be changes. There's Bill 108. Last year I mentioned the OMB was gone. Well, in this bill, the CRB, the Conservation Review Board, is as good as gone. They have some residual powers, but nothing that you as municipal heritage committees will deal with. Instead, you'll be going to LPATs, the Local Planning Appeals Tribunal, and they will have the final say on designations, alterations, demolitions. They will be the final authority instead of the municipality if this bill is passed. This week we sent our comments. We rushed, and I'm sorry we didn't get them out to all municipalities, but we had to meet the deadline, June the 1st. So on Monday we sent our comments into the committee. But there are lots of regulations that are going to be coming out of this bill, and you should be aware that they are going to have to deal publicly with those regulations. And they will affect everything from criteria to processes, so be aware that they are coming. And we are going to talk about the impacts of the changes in the Act in the Municipal Heritage Committee orientation session. So it doesn't apply to just new MHC members, but also existing MHC members. So I'd like to thank for the conference the Goderich Bluewater Local Organizing Committee, the Architecture Conservancy of Ontario, the Ontario Association of Heritage Professionals, and you for attending. Please enjoy. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'd also like now to introduce Marcus Letourneau, who is going to welcome delegates on behalf of the Ontario Association of Heritage Professionals.
Well, good morning. I apologize. I'm a little stiff. I was in a car accident, so I'm going to use the podium to sort of prop myself up. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the Ontario Association of Heritage Professionals, I'm again very pleased and honored to welcome everyone to the Ontario Heritage Conference. I would particularly like to thank the work of CHO, ACO, and the local organizing committee on organizing what I hope will be a very exciting and informative conference. As always, I'm excited to see so many people here today who are passionate and dedicated to the conservation of Ontario's diverse cultural heritage. For those of you who are not familiar with the Ontario Association of Heritage Professionals, we are the Ontario branch of the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals, which is a national organization of heritage professionals, essentially the people who do heritage for a living. We represent many different professional disciplines and trades and represent both the private and the public sector. We are very pleased to be part of a larger heritage community that includes activists, community volunteers, politicians, and many others. And it is one of the reasons why I so enjoy the conferences such as this one. And it allows for members from different communities to discuss, debate, network, and learn. Education is, in my opinion, one of the most important things we can do as a community. And the Ontario Heritage Conference is a critical part of this effort. Again, welcome to the conference, and I sincerely wish everyone a great time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus, and I'm sorry about your accident. I'm glad you're vertical. Okay, at this time I'd like to introduce Rick Sickinger, who has worked very, very hard to pull this conference together on behalf of the County of Huron, which is also a significant sponsor of this event. Rick.
Thanks, Roma. Okay, I did not pull the conference together on behalf of I was a small support player. Anyway, I am very glad to be here this morning to introduce this morning's keynote speaker. I have been looking for reasons for at least the past decade to get this speaker here to Huron County. And finally, I was able to manipulate a committee into going along with me. So, small victories, only took a decade. Kelly Hill is president of Hill Strategies Research, a Hamilton-based company that combines rigorous, and I really like that word, Kelly, rigorous and reliable research on culture with clear and effective communications. Since 2002, Kelly has prepared nearly 400 research reports and presentations on arts and heritage, giving him a unique perspective on Canadian cultural sector. If you don't already sign up for the Arts Research Monitor newsletter through Hill Strategies, please do. It's a great resource. You will use the stats all the time in your reports to council and other decision makers. Finding credible data on the economic impacts and benefits of heritage can be challenging. I think we all know that. Luckily, we have Kelly here with us this morning to help us delve into it and identify some of the key benefits of heritage. Please welcome Kelly Hill.
Good morning, everybody. Just going to test. Working? Okay, good. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. 10 years in the making. I did not realize it had been quite that long, but I'm pleased to be here. The lapel's not working? I thought it was working. I can hear kind of an echo. All right, how about that? I hear yes, and then I hear no. Let's just do this.
I don't know. This is
That's up to them. There we go. Yes, everybody? Yes? Good. Okay, thank you. So this morning, now for something completely different. We're not going to talk about heritage conservation in particularly any way, shape, or form. We are going to talk about economics.
So, good morning. Please try not to fall asleep. That's my job, keeping you awake. So I'm going to start you with a little brain teaser. Let's say, for example, that you were organizing a heritage conference. And let's say for that heritage conference, 80 people registered, they spent $250 each, so you sold $20,000 in admissions to the conference. And let's say you had costs totaling $15,000, and I made up some costs here. This is a made-up example, slightly based on a reality that you might be able to guess. The venue rental, travel and accommodation, speakers' fees, program web design, total cost of $15,000. So my question out of this is, from the brain teaser is, what is the conference's direct economic impact? We've got three choices here. A, $35,000, which would be the $20,000 in the direct sales and the $15,000 that in the costs that you spent on the conference. B, $20,000, which is your total sales only. Or C would be the net amount if you take the $20,000 in sales and you subtract the $15,000 in costs. So A, B, or C, I'm going to leave you, let's sit with you for a little bit. I'm not going to ask for your answers quite yet. But a little brain teaser, I'm going to come back to this in a little bit once we've talked a little bit more about economic impact and Hill Strategies research. Thank you, Rick, for such kind words. Yes, we provide a lot of arts research information. Since 2002, I've probably hit 400 presentations and reports now, so I've been doing this for quite a while, and quite actively, let's say. If you want to sign up for any of our research publications or you want to check them out, you can sign up for our mailing list at hillstrategies.com. Rick mentioned the Arts Research Monitor, which provides synopses of qualitative and quantitative research efforts related to the arts, culture, and heritage. Largely related to the arts, but there is some heritage information in there as well. I'm funded by some arts councils and arts bodies, so the arts is the predominant element of a lot of the research I do. The Arts Research Monitor is it's not always simple, my job's not always simple, a one-page summary of arts research efforts from around the world, focusing on Canadian projects, but not exclusively Canadian projects. It's funded by the Ontario Arts Council and the Canada Council for the Arts. That information is categorized and searchable. So for example, if you went to the heritage section of the heritage topic, you selected a topic of heritage and you searched for economic impact within heritage, this is what you would see. Some of the economic impact resources specifically related to heritage in the Arts Research Monitor. So you can, my point here is that you can mine the data set that is the Arts Research Monitor since 2002 with 4 reports every issue, 10 issues per year, it's 40 times 20, almost 800 reports in the Arts Research Monitor over time, and you can see them all categorized and searchable on our website. The other major project that we do on an ongoing basis is the statistical. I love saying that word out loud. It's always the hardest one. And I cannot avoid the word statistics. There we go. Statistical Insights on the Arts, which is an in-depth exploration of Canadian arts data. There are 25-plus page reports, many tables and charts, really looking at in-depth information. It's new information to the sector, often taking Statistics Canada data and mining it for the cultural component, which is not often done. Thank you. I think that's better. We can see that better now. It's funded by the Ontario Arts Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, and the Department of Canadian Heritage. A couple of recent examples are Canadians' arts, culture, and heritage participation in 2016, and provincial and metropolitan area data on the same topic. Just going to roll over some of the key findings of a couple of those reports. For example, heritage attendance in 2016. This is the overall Canadian data. We did an infographic. This was one section of it. We found that 70% of Canadians visited a heritage site of some kind in 2016. 7 out of 10 people that you meet on the street randomly would have attended some kind of heritage site during the past year. That includes zoos, aquariums, botanical gardens, planetariums, and observatories. I love some of these StatsCan categories. That is my particular favorite. Trying to put that on a chart where there's about 50 characters in the title, that's not easy. Almost half of Canadians attended a zoo, aquarium, etc. in 2016. In the bottom left, 50% exactly attended an historic site in 2016. And then on the gallery and museum side, 39% of Canadians attended a public art gallery and 35% attended a museum. So there is substantial interest in heritage, as I'm sure you know, but these are maybe some numbers that you could use to indicate how important heritage is to the community at large. The second report in that list that I had earlier was on provincial heritage attendance rates. And what we found is that the Ontario number is 71%, which is one tick above the national average of 70%. Not the highest in the country, but by far not the lowest either. It's hard for Ontario data when Canada includes Ontario, which is about 40% of the country. It's hard for the Ontario data to actually be too far away from the national average because it defines the national average a lot of the time. We were also really happy to pull out local heritage attendance rates. Local meaning census metropolitan area only, and that was thrilling to us because this hadn't been done in my experience in the 20 years having comparable data across the country for local areas. Unfortunately, it would not include anything close to Huron County or Goderich itself or Bayfield. It's metropolitan area, so it is the larger areas. So we can see that compared to the national average, Hamilton, 73% of Hamilton residents attended some kind of heritage site in 2016. 70% of Toronto residents did, and 75% of Ottawa-Gatineau residents attended a heritage site in 2016. I'm going to do something unusual and go backwards because I added some content this morning and it's in my head. So here goes. As I mentioned earlier, the Ontario data doesn't diverge very much from the national data. 70% of Canadians visited a heritage site. It's one tick higher, 71% of Ontarians visited a heritage site. If you want to look at that differently, that's 8 million people in Ontario, 15 years of age or older, who attended a heritage site in 2016. So 8 million people can't be wrong, right? There's your slogan. And if you look at, what was interesting when I looked at these stats again this morning is that, I had a busy breakfast, is that when you look at the Ontario numbers, each one of these 5 statistics that we have in this chart, the Ontario number is one tick above the national number. So instead of 46% visiting zoos, aquariums, et cetera, it's 47%. Instead of 50% visiting an historic site, it's 51%. It's 40% for art galleries and 36% for museums. So each one of them happens to be one tick above the national average. That's the numbers there. So in addition to looking at the number of people, 8 million Ontarians visiting a heritage site of some kind in 2016, the 51% number of people visiting an historic site is almost 6 million Ontarians visited some kind of historic site in 2016. All right, now we're really going to get into the hardcore economics. So the number of people in the room with an economics degree, please put up your hands. Hey, we have someone. We have a few. I saw 2 hands go up at least, so there's a smattering of us. So there we go. We're going to move into a little bit more, let's call it economic theory. So here's where you can really have your nap. If you want to know the economic impacts of heritage, if you want to know the economic impacts of anything, there are some things you could measure. The direct economic impact is the direct spending on goods and services in the business or the organization or the sector. It's the definition used in most sectors and by Statistics Canada to capture gross domestic product. It avoids double counting. All of the other indicators would include some double counting, and I'll tell you about that in a second. So it's the cleanest and also the smallest indicator of economic impact, is direct impacts. You could go further, and many studies do go further. If you look at the indirect spending, that is the respending of payments to suppliers. So for example, if a heritage conference was to hire a speaker and that speaker spent money on supplies, example, gas, getting to that conference, then that the spending of that speaker could also be included in the conference's economic impact, but it would be a direct economic, indirect, excuse me, economic impact. Induced would be respending of wages earned by workers for the organization and suppliers' workers. So staff members would earn money through the event that we're talking about. If we're talking about the conference, then they would respend that on a variety of goods and services, and that could be included in the economic impact of that event. That would be called the induced impact. And there's one further level that you could go to, and that would be ancillary or tourism spending. And that is usually a large number, but that is where, for example, for the conference, you would not only count what people spent at the conference itself, but what they spent on hotels, what they spent on restaurants, bars, staying up till 12 o'clock at night, cheering on the Raptors, etc. So that would be the ancillary impacts. At the top, the most common is direct, capturing direct impacts. It's the basis for everything else. The least common is ancillary tourism spending at the bottom. The easiest, actually I shouldn't call it easy. I intentionally did not use the word easy in the presentation. The least difficult is to capture the direct economic impact. The most difficult is to capture the ancillary and tourism spending at the bottom. How would you go about doing it? Well, the indirect and induced impacts are usually captured via an economic model that is often called an input-output model. There's tables at the national level and I believe the provincial level that would help you get to that. If you wanted to know about ancillary and tourism spending, the best thing you could do is do a survey of, let's say, the attendees at the Heritage Conference and ask them how much they spent. So those are some of the measurements, but what are we trying, there's some of the ways to measure things, but what are we trying to measure? Gross domestic product is the most common. It's the market value of all final goods and services in a given time, in a year. In the UK, this is often referred to as gross value added. I've got a couple of UK examples coming up, so I just wanted to mention that. They label it as GVA, which is equivalent to what we would call GDP. Jobs is pretty straightforward. It's an impact on employment levels. It's usually a head count rather than a full-time equivalent, but I've seen full-time equivalents being captured in economic impact analyses as well. But usually it's just how many people had some kind of job, whether it was part-time, part-year, or full-time, full year. Output is another indicator of economic impact that StatsCan actually produces as well, but it is a calculation of all sales in all organizations in the supply chain. So for the conference, it would include the revenues of the conference itself, the revenues of the speakers, the revenues of the hotel that was directly, I heard a bit of feedback, sorry, that was directly involved in the conference, the impact of renting rooms, etc., food, all of that would be captured at every stage of the process of producing that conference. So that would include double counting. It would actually be the sum of all outputs is larger than national GDP or provincial GDP. So there is some, what we would call double counting. And a lot of models also take a look at taxes, which is a nice number to have if you're trying to make a case to government. Back when StatsCan used to capture not just economic impact of the sector, but also direct spending on culture, we would often do a comparison of the two, and the GDP and taxes impact were many times larger than the expenditures of government in the sector. So that was a talking point, but those data are about 10 years old now, so it's not being captured by StatsCan anymore due to cutbacks at their level back in the day. All right, that's the theory part of the presentation. Let's talk about some numbers. Taking a look at the direct economic impact of arts, culture, and heritage industries in Ontario, this is based on a thoroughly old report. It's a month old now from StatsCan. Mostly it's a series of tables. There's a brief text summary Provincial and territorial culture indicators. Largely, those are economic impact indicators, but they just call them provincial and territorial culture indicators. The base year is 2017. They're usually about 2 years behind getting the data out, and that's the case here. 2017 data came out early in 2019. You are the first people to see some of this specific analysis because it's going to be included in next month's Arts Research Monitor, because we're not into June yet, are we? Still in May. It'll be in June's Arts Research Monitor, but it's not been captured there yet, so we've done some per capita and comparative analysis that nobody else in the world has seen yet. So in Ontario, the direct impact on GDP in 2017 was $26.7 billion. That's the arts, culture, and heritage overall. That equates to, sorry, I don't have these memorized, $1,900 per capita. If I remember the draft of the next month's monitor correctly, that's the largest per capita amount in Canada. So the highest impact overall in Ontario. Over 300,000 jobs directly related to culture industries in Ontario. And when I say culture industries, we mean arts, culture, and heritage all lumped together. That's just over 4% of all jobs in the province. So about 4% of all jobs in the province are arts, culture, and heritage. So when we do some comparisons of that, okay, $26.7 billion, sounds nice. $1,900 per person, 4% of all jobs. What does that mean relative to some other sectors in the economy? Well, on the left in purple, you can see the culture industry's impact of $26.7 billion. The red ones in the middle are things that have a direct economic impact that is lower than the culture sector. For example, sports, $3 billion. Mining, quarrying, oil and gas extraction is about $7 billion, excuse me. Agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting altogether, $7 billion. Utilities, about $15 billion. Accommodation and food services overall, about $16 billion. So in all of these cases, the culture sector is much larger than each of those sectors individually. The culture sector is obviously not the largest sector of the economy. Some that are larger. Transportation and warehousing is slightly larger, I would say, $5 billion larger. Educational services is larger. Construction is obviously quite a bit larger, but I do find it interesting that the economic impact of culture is about half of that of the economic impact of construction overall. Because I think people think of construction as this great big booming sector, and it's large, but it's only twice as large as culture, so culture is a significant economic force. The burning question in the room, possibly, what about heritage? Let's try to take heritage away from the other arts and culture elements that we have. I'm afraid that I have good news and I have bad news on that front. The good news is that StatsCan has a heritage and libraries category in the data set. The bad news is that it only captures privately owned heritage. And that has an impact of $144 million in Ontario. The government-owned heritage and library facilities, which I presume would be the bulk of them, would be included in a broader category called governance, funding, and professional support. And that has a $3.3 billion direct impact on GDP. So if you ask me what the direct economic impact of heritage specifically was in Ontario, I would say somewhere between $144 million and $3 billion. I'm afraid I can't be a lot more helpful than that this morning. Okay, coming back to the measurements, direct spending, indirect is the respending of payments to suppliers, induced is the respending of wages earned by workers and suppliers' workers, ancillary and tourism spending is visitor spending. Some of these other examples that I've pulled out, I couldn't find a lot of heritage economic impact studies. I did find a couple in the UK. actually one study, I've got a couple of charts from it. It's about heritage tourism specifically. So it is only the tourism component, so it's not the infrastructure component, let's call it that. But they took a look at heritage tourism economic impact. And they found, here's a nice complicated chart for you. On the left-hand side is the GVA, so that's the equivalent of our GDP. The dark blue at the bottom, is that 9 billion pounds? Yeah, thank you, 9 billion pounds, is the direct economic impact of heritage tourism in the UK. That is how this company has measured that specific impact. But you can see that they've gone beyond the direct numbers, which would be roughly the equivalent of what StatsCan has produced in Canada, not the same basket of activities included. StatsCan includes arts, culture, and heritage, of course. This is just about heritage tourism. But the direct, in terms of the direct impact, is $9 billion, and you can see the indirect and the induced impacts on top more than double that number to over 20 billion pounds. So my point really here, basically the same thing in the jobs area, 191,000 jobs on the right-hand side in the right-hand chart, portion of the chart, and that is basically doubled by the indirect and induced. My point here is that the direct impact, as I mentioned earlier, this is a visual representation of that, is a relatively smaller number. Indirect and induced can be really important as well in terms of the overall impact. If you wanted the biggest number, you'd capture more things. If you're just capturing direct economic impact, you've got a smaller number. Maybe it would be double if you had the induced and indirect, but there's not a general rule. Unfortunately, you can't just say it's going to be twice as much. But in these examples, it's roughly in the twice as much. That study looked also by type of heritage attraction. So they included on the left, historic built environment, in the middle, museums and galleries, and on the right, it also includes natural heritage. And you can see for each one of these, the dark blue bottom portion is roughly half of the total size of the bar, with varying amounts of indirect and induced impacts for each of the others. A Canadian example of the culture sector broadly writ, but a local study from Niagara region, was an economic impact study there that divided direct, indirect, induced impacts, and also has a measurement of ancillary/tourism impact on the far right. So you see here the direct economic impact, 176, I'm gonna think that's million, yep, $176 million on the far left, over 100 million in indirect impact, another 16, 17 million in induced impacts. So again, the indirect and induced are important contributors to overall economic impact. But if you go so far as to capture ancillary spending, as this report did, that number becomes so much bigger, 300 million in ancillary/cultural tourism spending. So that overall number in Niagara was $595 million, and over half of that came from the ancillary or tourism spending. All right, so let's come back to the brain teaser. Now that you know everything there is to know about economic impact of heritage, what do you think, A, B, or C? A, $35,000 economic impact of the conference, 20,000 sales plus 15,000 costs. Is anybody voting for A? Quite a few people voting for A. How about B, $20,000, which is the total sales? I see 1, 2 people. And how about the net of 5,000, which is your 20,000 sales minus your 15,000 costs? I see 1 or 2 as well there. There's kind of 2 right answers here. So it's a bit of a trick question. There's one that is more right than the other, I'd say. Option A is the capture of output. So that would include the double counting element. So your 20,000 in sales plus your $15,000 in costs would be the measurement of outputs overall. If you wanted to measure the direct economic impact on GDP, the net impact, it would be B, the total sales. All right, economic impact is not the be-all and end-all, of course. Despite having an economics degree, I recognize that. That's why I work in the arts and not in a bank. There are more things to life than economics, believe it or not. What doesn't economic impact analysis capture? Intangible benefits, very important in the heritage sector, also called non-use values. This was an Australian study that had a nice little summary of this that I pulled. The existence value, that means that even if somebody may or may not visit, let's say, an historic site themselves, but they might like to know that it's there for the community, for society as a whole. They might think of it as a good thing, and so it might have value for them even if they don't attend personally. Option value. Well, I haven't gone in the past, but I might like to go at some point. So I'm glad that it's there. I'll get to it at some point. That's basically the option value. I have the option of doing that when time permits. The bequest value is when somebody would think something along the lines of, well, I haven't gone, I don't think I'm going to go, but I'm happy that my grandkids would have the opportunity to go there. So I think it is a good thing for our community that it is there, even though I personally don't attend. Those are some intangible benefits that we're not talking about at all in economic impact analysis. What else does an economic impact analysis capture? Social, non-monetary, other hard-to-capture benefits, aesthetic value, educational benefits, civic pride, community cohesiveness, attraction of businesses and workers to the community. If you contribute to the attractiveness of the community in a general way, that is not captured in almost all economic impact analyses. Almost none of them capture that. The contributions to creativity and innovation might be important, especially in the cultural sector. And health and well-being. I'm going to talk a little bit about well-being in a second. It's not an economic impact number per se, but it is, I think, an important impact. In case you're interested, here's a few useful sources regarding economic impact. And I have not yet mentioned this, and I should mention it. I've got it at the slide at the end, and I should have had it at the beginning. This presentation, I haven't been able to check yet this morning, but it should be already on my website, in the presentation section of the website. So if you want the details of any of the findings that I've got today, I'm sorry to those of you who have been taking copious notes so far. I apologize in retrospect. You can download the presentation, and if it didn't work, it didn't pop up this morning, as it should have at 5 a.m., I will get it there soon, but it should be there already. If anybody has got an active device, if they want to go to hillstrategies.com, check in the presentation section, it should be right at the top. Thank you, Rick. It is there, so it worked. Okay, so the sources are available in my presentation. You can download the presentation, you can link to the actual sources. Canadian Heritage has an economic impact model specifically designed for culture, arts, heritage, and sport. So if you were going to undertake an economic impact analysis yourself, I'd say that would be your first place to go. Take a look at what they have. They've got a guide, kind of like the theory guide that I've just gone through with you, and they've got resources to actually capture it. What do you need to do? How do you need to do it? They've got some tips there. Another good source that I've pulled from for part of this presentation, The Basics of Economic Impact Analysis by Canadian and US researchers and economic development professionals. It's available on SlideShare. That presentation is really good because it talks about the pitfalls as well. It doesn't just talk about all the things you can do, it's all the things that can go wrong and all the things you have to be really careful about in an economic impact analysis. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the Arts Research Monitor, the economic impact section specifically. If this is what you're really interested in, is economic impact, take a look there and click on the topic of economic impact, and you'll see all of the resources that we've written about over the past 17 years. All right, so for the final part of my presentation, I'm going to really pretty quickly run over how and whether heritage participation might be connected to individual well-being. This is going back to some statistics from 2010. Sorry, we haven't done this report, updated this report for 2016 statistics that I just talked about in terms of the overall attendance numbers. We haven't done the well-being connection analysis yet. Hope to do that. It's not on the agenda this year, but hopefully next fiscal year we'll get that in. So the basics of the analysis is that we're comparing people who attended a heritage, an historic site, whatever it might be, a heritage activity once during the year to people who attended 0 times during the year. And we're taking a comparison of the situation of those two groups of people on a bunch of indicators of health and well-being. Average health for each, for example, if we compare it across the two and see which type of attendee, or the attendees versus non-attendees, who has better health overall. That's the simplistic way of looking at the analysis. We looked at 18 arts, culture, and heritage activities, including museums and galleries, performing arts and festivals, film, video, audio, and of course the heritage activities, historic sites, zoos, conservation areas, and nature parks. In this one, we've included the conservation areas and the nature parks, so natural heritage as well, whereas the earlier numbers I was talking about was largely was cultural heritage specifically. So we took a look at 18 arts, culture, and heritage activities, and we looked at attendees and non-attendees, and then we looked at their differences between attendees and non-attendees for each of those activities on 8 indicators of health, well-being, and social connectedness. Self-reported health, self-reported mental health, volunteering rates, whether people feel trapped in a daily routine, their general levels of stress, their knowledge of their neighbors, whether they have done a favor for the neighbor. I think that was in the past month. So if you've shoveled somebody else's driveway, shoveled somebody else's walkway, I think of doing that. Those are my examples because that's what I do for my neighbors. Not in the last month, thankfully. Self-reported satisfaction with life overall is the last of the 8 indicators that we took a look at. So when we look at historic site visitors, this is all Canadian data. I don't have Ontario-specific data for this study. 46% of Canadians in 2010 visited an historic site. Again, that's the older number for that. But when you look at that, the attendees at historic sites versus non-attendees, we find that attendees had significantly better results for 7 of the 8 well-being indicators compared with those who didn't visit an historic site. The same results for visitors to zoos, aquariums, botanical gardens, planetariums, or observatories. Slightly different attendance number, but significantly better results for 7 of 8 well-being indicators as well. Here's a nice complicated slide showing you the significant differences between heritage site visitors and heritage site non-visitors. So on the left, in the, what does it appear, a darker pink, darker red possibly? Let's go with red. In the darker red is the historic site visitors. In the bottom, you can see the far left is health, people who reported excellent or very good health to the study, 50-something% compared to 40-something% of non-attendees. So there's a significant difference in health reporting. There's a significant difference in mental health reporting. There's a significant difference in volunteer rates. What the heck is value? Sorry, I see that we've got a few numbers that haven't showed up in this version of the presentation, and I apologize for that. It's in the online one. Volunteer rates are significantly higher for historic site attendees than non-attendees. A significantly smaller number of historic site attendees feel trapped in a daily routine.
The stress level is the one where there was not a significant difference between attendees and non-attendees. Knowledge of neighbors was higher for attendees than non-attendees. Doing a favor for a neighbor was higher for historic site visitors than non-visitors. And overall satisfaction with life, higher percentage reported a very high satisfaction with life level of attendees versus non-attendees. It's a somewhat simplistic analysis, but I think also a useful analysis of how there might be differences based on attendance at historic sites. I think it provides some connection, evidence of a connection to well-being. Well, if you look at the broad picture of that study, when we take all of the 8 social indicators, we take all of the 18 arts, culture, and heritage activities, that gives us 144 potential connections between arts, culture, and heritage activities and well-being. We found that attendees had statistically significantly better results than non-attendees on 101 of the 144 social connections or well-being indicators. That's 70% overall. So in 70% of the cases, people who did something at least once had a better result for the social indicator than people who did not do that thing at all. As I said, that's kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of doing this kind of analysis. And this is where the focus on the arts kicks in a little bit more. We did some stronger correlations and a more robust statistical analysis of certain arts activities and certain of the indicators of health and well-being. So we took 6 arts activities and 3 indicators of health and well-being, and we ran a statistical model. We created and ran a statistical model on this saying if somebody attended an art gallery, given what we know about their level of education, household income, age group, sex, children at home, we corrected for, in the statistical model, a number of socioeconomic characteristics. We also looked at whether people were indigenous, visible minority, immigrant, or whether they had done physical activity in the past week, because that could also have an impact on their level of health and well-being. So we controlled for all of these characteristics in a statistical model. And we found, for example, for theater attendees, they were 32% more likely to have very good or excellent health than non-attendees, even once we controlled for all of those other socioeconomic indicators. They were 30% more likely to have very strong satisfaction with life, and they were way more likely to volunteer than non-theater attendees. And this is not volunteering at theater specifically, this is just volunteering in general. So on top of the possible socioeconomic characteristics that have an influence on health, satisfaction with life, and volunteering, it seems like there is an additional impact that can't be explained by socioeconomic characteristics alone for people who attend theater. That's essentially what we're saying in this analysis. When we look across the 6 arts activities and the 3 indicators of well-being in this analysis, we found that there was a significant positive correlation in 16 out of the 18 boxes. There were only a couple cases where there was not a statistically significant association between, for example, top-line art gallery visits and stronger satisfaction with life. So that also provides pretty strong evidence. Even stronger evidence for these specific indicators, and again, they're arts indicators, arts activities rather than heritage activities, but it is a very strong indication that there is an influence somehow between a connection, let's say, a correlation between arts attendance and satisfaction with life, health, and volunteering. It's not a perfect analysis. We've just taking a look at attendance once in a year. That's a very low threshold. There's been studies talking about repeated or deeper engagement having larger impacts. We're not accounting for any of that here. In this study, we just looked at if somebody went once, they were in the attendee category, and if somebody did not go at all during that 1 year, they were in the non-attendee category.
There's other potential things that were not available in the data set. For example, influences on health such as smoking and alcohol consumption. They were not asked about in the survey, so we did not capture that in our analysis. A little bit more philosophical level, does arts participation always foster or strengthen social ties? Are there cultural participation activities that do it better than others? We didn't address this. The chain of causality could go in either direction. People could have a higher quality of life because they participate in the arts, or people who already have a higher quality of life might tend to participate in the arts more. So it could go in both directions, and it might be mutually reinforcing. Social inequality also plays a role in that it could contribute to differences in arts participation rates, and that could start to reinforce some of the lower health outcomes of people in lower income situations, for example. So that could be a problem if, for example, in our schools, arts education is cut. That might be the one place where people from lower income households could participate in culture in some way, shape, or form. So it could have a negative reinforcing effect at that level. And now I mention for all of those of you who are scribbling notes, the presentation's available online. Rick has confirmed it. The presentation's there. You can download the PDF version of it. hillstrategies.com/presentations. And I want to thank you. That's all the time I've got for my presentation. If you've got some questions, I think Rick is going to probably take my mic. We'll figure it out if you've got some questions, thoughts, concerns about what I've talked about this morning. Please let us know. If you want to relate an economic impact anecdote you might have from your municipality, cool. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was really wonderful. And it's things that I know we've been all thinking about. And one of the questions that came to my mind as I saw it, I wonder if, for example, a government invested in an arts, culture, and heritage, would it mean that they could spend less in healthcare? And not that I expect an answer to the second part of this is, how do you convince them?
There was, the shorter answer to that is probably. The first part of the question is probably, that yes, probably they could spend less on healthcare. And it's interesting that you posed the question in just that way, because it wasn't a research report per se, but it was an editorial in the British Journal of Health. That's not quite right. A British journal had an editorial that said, spend more on the arts means less spending on healthcare. That was the editorial. The editor, who was a doctor, said, we need to increase culture spending in our society because that will help lower our spending on health. So he made, I think it was a he made exactly that argument. It's got a date from 10, 12 years ago now, but it's just stuck in my mind because it was almost phrased in exactly the same way you phrased it. That spend more on culture, spend less on healthcare was the point of that. It hasn't been, let's say, proven in an analysis, but it is certainly possible. Mm-hmm. How do you convince them? That's a bigger discussion point.
Thank you.
There is a trend right now of doctors prescribing for patients
Yes,
to
there
go
is some
to galleries and
prescriptions going
museums.
on now, prescription of outings to the museum. Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you have any sense of the impact of Doors Open on the number on the historic sites visits. Is that is there a jump in that number that shows up when Doors Open becomes more active, or is that, that's either an extra set or it's in the data?
It's obviously not going to hurt. Let's put it that way. Unfortunately, let me provide a little context here. StatsCan only produces only asks these cultural questions it's not even regular, every 5, 6, 7 years. So I don't have year-to-year data to say, where did it start to take off? Did it start to take off in a certain year when things became really active for Doors Open? I can't really make a connection between the two. It can't obviously hurt, but over time, when we looked at some trends in cultural participation over time, broadly writ, including some of the heritage indicators, the trends were positive. But the trends were positive in a bunch of arts activities that wouldn't necessarily be impacted by Doors Open as well. So it's hard to say what the factors were. We don't have a good analysis of the factors in the increased participation, but in general, a higher proportion of residents tend to be participating, attending at least once in almost all of the activities that we measured, other than ones that were pretty obvious, such as listening to CDs. That's gone way down. There's another question in the front, but I think there was some a bit further back. Thank you.
One indicator that wasn't on, but I think it's really important, is the intergenerational aspect of culture and heritage. I find in our small community, it brings the old and the young together, and you know, to measure that is difficult, but it's just another indicator I think that we can talk about.
Yes, and if you were doing an economic impact analysis and you wanted to capture some broader indicators like that, I'd call that a social indicator. You'd do a survey of your visitors, and you could ask something like that on a survey of your visitors and say, who did you come with today? And was there different generations somehow getting at that aspect of it, if you wanted to make that case. That's how you would capture it, and I agree that that would be a useful social indicator. It's what, you know, for an economic impact analysis, that impact on the impact on dollars would be a few steps away. So that's not really a dollars question, it's more a living in society question. And we all know that the dollars are way more important, so let's just forget about the other stuff. Rick, after that, if you don't mind coming back up front, there was a question here.
Regarding your statistics, et cetera, when I look at society today, I see we have 2 working people in a family normally, and the kids are almost all in competitive sports, which doesn't leave much time for them to get involved. And I'm surprised statistics didn't go down due to the stresses on modern families in terms of time to participate in heritage particularly, or events like that.
A valid point. Time is the #1 challenge in terms of getting people out to arts, culture, and heritage activities. And related to that, arts education is the #1 factor in arts attendance later on in life. So if people aren't starting young, they tend not to start as much later on. So I'd agree with you that there's a bit of surprise that given the state of arts education and given the state of how busy people's lives are, it hasn't gone down, but it generally hasn't.
You're measuring visits. Today, people are virtually visiting places. And they're gaining a lot of information, not by physical connection with things, but with virtual connections with things. Are you penetrating that area at all, or is that, I mean, the technology you use?
The short answer to that is no. That the survey that I've talked about most of the time here from StatsCan is one that captures in-person visitors. Did you go to something? It's not did you view something remotely online. It's not did you. It's a bit more mobile friendly when it comes to things like reading books and magazines, etc. It includes, there's a category for doing it online versus in a physical book. But for things like attendance, it's about getting there. So largely the studies that I look at, the surveys that I look at, they don't capture virtual attendance. So it's a harder one to capture, and it's not being done all that well that much of the time.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. Yeah. Now the hands go up.
I'm just wondering if you've looked at the impact of having free admission for museums versus not. They've been doing that for a long time in Europe. I know the government's now offering free admission on the go downtown to take kids to the aquarium, but there doesn't seem as much interest in getting them into museums. So I'm wondering if you've looked at that at all, if there's been a comparison done.
I haven't looked at that question specifically, but I have noted, let's say anecdotally, that the costs of attending a lot of, I think of arts activities, the costs of a single ticket admission to the Art Gallery of Ontario has gone up by a lot over the time frame of the information that I have from StatsCan, which actually dates back to 1992 is the earliest iteration of this survey. So we do have almost 30 years of data very sporadically. And the numbers have gone up, at art galleries specifically, gone up by a lot. And that particularly has surprised me somewhat because the cost of going to many art galleries, at least some of the art galleries, has really gone up strongly as well. So in that case, there didn't seem to be a direct connection, but the numbers that I'm talking about here are really too broad to do that kind of more fine-grained analysis, so it's not the best way to take a look at it, but that did surprise me a little bit that it had gone up so much when the costs of doing things have gone up pretty, in some cases, pretty significantly.
Okay, let's see if our mic's dual. I would like to thank Kelly for coming this morning. Hopefully it won't take another 10 years to find an excuse to bring you to Huron County. So thank you very much. Lots to unpack there. One of my takeaways is we're spending 2 days at a heritage conference, so our well-being indicators will go way up.
Way up.
We made the correct health decision by attending the conference. Have this little gift for you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Rick. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Kelly. That was really interesting, and I'm sure people will be wanting to mill around afterward and ask you some questions. We have an unexpected little departure here in the program, just very briefly. I'd like to invite Leslie Thompson, the chair of the board of the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario, who has a special announcement.
Thank you very much. We need that well-being because I know many people in this room probably are waking up every morning with quite a sense of outrage with regards to what Schedule 11 in Bill 108. So we'd like to propose that be it resolved that the 2019 Ontario Heritage Conference is in agreement that the Government of Ontario's proposed changes to the Ontario Heritage Act contained in Schedule 11 of Bill 108 were developed without adequate participation of Ontario's cultural heritage sector and are badly flawed, and Schedule 11 be withdrawn from the bill and a targeted consultation process involving key stakeholders be undertaken to address improvements to the Ontario Heritage Act approval process. All in favor? Okay. Opposed? I see none. Passed. Thank you very much. Now, just one quick thing. If you haven't got your submissions in to the government yet and other places, we have a table and we're happy to help you get them in because it's the end of the month and they're due. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.